All right, you got it. Close this thing back up.
Yeah.
Nate? Be careful.
Come on. I always am. Ah! I did not see that!
I'm here off the coast of Panama where we just recovered what we believe to be the coffin of legendary explorer Sir Francis Drake, who was buried at sea over 400 years ago. Are you sure you want to be defiling your ancestors' remains like that?
You make it sound so dirty. Besides, thought you didn't believe me.
Well, I did do my research, and apparently Francis Drake didn't have any children.
Well, history can't be wrong, you know. For example, you can't defile an empty coffin.
What the hell?
You devil.
If there's one standout element in Naughty Dog's Uncharted Drake's Fortune, it's the writing style. It's remarkably laconic. In just a few lines, we get a full sense of our protagonist Nathan Drake, a charming rogue with a hint of evasiveness, and Elena Fisher, a no-nonsense reporter who can cut through his charm and bullshit with ease. Soon after, we'll also be introduced to Victor Goddamn Sullivan, essentially an older version of Nate who's experienced enough to know when it's best to sprinkle in a few sweet words.
Well, if it isn't the beautiful and talented Elena Fisher.
Flattery will get you screen time.
Yeah, I'm more of a behind-the-scenes kind of guy. Victor Sullivan.
For Christ's sakes.
These characters are instantly memorable and relatable, which makes it all the stranger that they look like plastic figures, even in the PS4 remaster, not to mention the 2007 PS3 original. There is a certain degree of stylization in Uncharted that feels deliberate. The exaggerated facial expressions that can change 50 times per second, the absolutely wild death physics of enemies that are sent flying in a way no bullet impact can ever cause, while on the other hand having weirdly cartoony and small explosions that barely affect anyone beyond a few meters. The writing and acting scream, "We are real people." The graphics in turn shout, "We are a cartoon." And that's far from the only instance of the game pulling itself in different directions. Although there's nothing really foreshadowing any problems in the first tutorial chapter that teaches the basics of shooting and melee combat as pirates attack the ship you're on. Mainly because it's very short. It's just that Uncharted didn't want to start with an exposition dump, preferring to have a bit of gameplay before delivering one. That said, while exposition dump might sound negative, thanks to the writing style, Uncharted handles it with brevity, delivering all the key information in a tight 2.5 minutes. The TV show Elena is working for has funded an expedition to record a documentary about Sir Francis Drake. Nathan claims to be Drake's descendant and turns out to be right about the English privateer faking his death, finding a diary instead of a body. In this diary, Francis Drake has recorded coordinates in the Amazon to the famed City of Gold itself, the El Dorado. With Nate wanting fame and fortune alongside proving the legitimacy of his claims, and Sully needing a hefty sum of cash to pay off his own debts, they decide to leave Elena behind to make sure nobody gets on their trail should they share that knowledge.
Because we're gonna have every two-bit scumbag in the world racing us to this treasure unless we cut her loose right now.
You're a real gentleman, Sully.
I know. It stinks. She'll get over it.
Hi. No, I don't trust him, okay? That's why we need to move fast. So just get me the camera crew, and I promise you that... Son of a bitch. much.
Drake's Fortune channels the feel of classic pulpy adventure books and movies, setting the foundation for what heroes in those stories do: explore uncharted lands, uncover forgotten mysteries, and fight against overwhelming odds. Mechanically, these aspects can be represented through platforming, puzzles, and combat, all potentially great systems, all being various levels of flawed in terms of implementation. But Uncharted is kind enough to introduce its issues gradually. The second chapter, really the first full-length one, has no combat. As Nate and Sully explore the Amazon jungle, Drake's Fortune teaches us the basics of platforming, the least problematic part of the game. This is mainly due to a magnetism effect present in the majority of jumping mechanics. Out in the open, they're not effective at all, but when aiming towards platforms within jumping distance, Nate will play appropriate animations to reach them. For a feeling of authenticity, there's no mid-air control, so once the jump animation begins, you're locked in. Should Drake jump from a high point, he'll roll on landing. If that roll takes him over the edge of the platform, he will safely latch on. Except, half the time, he won't. And more often than not, that results in your death. In theory, the ledge platforming mechanics should be incredibly safe. You're limited to jumping only towards reachable ledges. Except sometimes you aren't, and you're lucky if that's because Nate has detected something farther away to cling to. Pressing the jump button while shimmying on a ledge speeds up Drake's movement. Except sometimes he will launch himself instead, most likely towards a deadly pit. Sometimes Nate hops off vines just fine. Other times, he acts like a cat in a fail video. Despite their simplicity, the platforming mechanics are unreliable, creating a lack of trust that's compounded by the game's environment design. Most of the time, Uncharted doesn't visually mark grabbable ledges. On its own, this isn't really an issue. In a game like this, it's reasonable to ask players to search for protrusions to climb. However, issues arise from grabbable and ungrabbable ledges looking exactly the same. Surely Drake can't grip something without a flat surface on top, and yet he can. Surely he can grab a protrusion with a clear 90-degree edge, and yet often he can't. To be fair, this inconsistency rarely interferes with progressing on the main path. Most of the time it's clear enough where you have to go. But Uncharted scatters collectible treasures along optional paths. Useless trinkets, really, unless you just want to compulsively collect everything or are interested in the game's bonus unlockables and medal system. But still, searching for them can be frustrating when Nate does a small hop instead of grabbing something that in other situations he totally would. Although sometimes it's just bugs. Occasionally, Drake won't turn a corner. Try again and again, and he will. Sometimes Drake just won't grab onto something. Try again and he will. Though it's a small consolation when try again means replay the segment after dying.
Drake!
Wait a second. It's something to do with these symbols.
It's ironic that the Amazon jungle where Nate and Sully hunt for El Dorado is as much an introduction to platforming as it is to the mechanical issues. But at least overall, most jumping segments work better than another aspect Drake's Fortune throws our way: puzzles. If you can even call them that. Look, I'm not saying that a game like Uncharted needs to wreck our brains. It's absolutely fine if puzzles are very simple and serve only a pace-breaking role. But there is a difference between simple and just directly following instructions from Sir Francis Drake's diary. Gee, I wonder what 1, 2, 3, and 4 could possibly mean. Oh, this requires some logical thinking. There are 4 names near each figure, and the same 4 names are near the compass directions. What a perplexing conundrum. Yeah, I don't know. Let me think. Maybe... no. I mean, there are so many possible different interpretations here. Yeah, no, I give up. Let's just find a guide. Oh. Yeah, I have no clue how the game ever intended anyone to figure this shit out. Sarcasm aside, it's a shame Drake's fortune doesn't even try smudging even a single drawing, leaving us with at least one partial clue where we'd have to connect a dot or two ourselves. Then again, there aren't that many puzzles in the game in the first place, so it's not a major drawback. There are a couple situations where you have to do something not related to the diary, but they are few and far between. Honestly, I'd have welcomed even more of those instructional puzzles if it meant replacing some combat sequences, because Uncharted's shootouts sometimes are seemingly endless and therefore tiresome. While Drake's fortune does begin with a little action sequence, it is Chapter 3 specifically that's going to be our first real dive into the game's combat mechanics. Following clues from Francis Drake, Nate and Sully find out that El Dorado isn't actually a city, but a massive golden statue. And the temple it was worshipped in was ransacked by Spaniards before old Francis could reach it. While following the tracks, the duo stumbles upon a Nazi U-boat wreckage that feels suspiciously hinky.
Let's check it out, huh?
Wait. Something about this feels kinda hinky.
Hinky. You act like you've never seen a German U-boat in the middle of the jungle before.
Nate gives Drake's diary to Sully for safekeeping and ventures to explore the submarine. There, he discovers the crew's dead bodies, one of which held a map previously torn from Drake's diary, of an island with a lost Spanish colony. The Germans were clearly after the same treasure, since they had a Kriegsmarine map of their own with coordinates to the location of that exact island. It's a good thing too that Nate has found two maps, since Sully went against his own advice and told Gabriel Roman, the blandest, most forgettable old white dude to ever exist in this universe that Sully owes money to, that they're onto something big. Dahlman decided to get a bunch of mercs and find the treasure himself, taking the German map from Nate and shooting Sully. While running away, Nate encounters Elena, who was tracking them down, and now they have to fight through Old Man's mercenary army to escape. This is but the first of many fights waiting for us in Uncharted, and shooting here is functional at best. All weapons feel pretty much alike. Yes, each has different animations, some variations in recoil, and of course the actual damage output is not the same. And yet, in terms of game feel, a pistol doesn't seem significantly different from a shotgun, which controls exactly like a grenade launcher. As a result, unless you're interested in the medal system that's also connected to trophies, there's no real reason to experiment with different weapons. In fact, a simple pistol is gonna be your best go-to choice, as it's the easiest to make headshots with even if the enemy is far away. Bad guys often stand still long enough for you to line up headshots, which are a guaranteed one-hit kill unless your opponent has a helmet, and only some of them will, only close to the end of the game. So, headshot, 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 headshot. That's all you need. Oh, and cover, of course. The bad guys are exceptionally good at aiming even from far distances. One of the reasons why I wouldn't recommend even thinking about playing Uncharted on anything higher than normal difficulty, unless you just can't live without self-inflicted pain. Dodging will not let you consistently avoid shots, although it might give enough time for health regeneration to kick in. Therefore, you're unlikely to make efficient use of the game's bare-bones melee combo system. Not that big of a deal really, since there's only two combos anyway, a quick one and brutal doesn't work on certain enemy types. You can also attack foes from behind, but that's very rarely used outside of sometimes having a chance to silently take down one or two mooks before you're forced into open combat. While brutal combos do provide extra ammo, at the end of the day it doesn't justify trying to run towards particularly accurate enemies. The better strategy is to just sit behind cover and pop out every now and then to make some headshots, especially considering that your opponents are dumber than dumb brocks. Most of them won't try to make way towards you or flank you. There are some specific enemy types that are scripted to run at your location in the open, while against them it's still better to just sit in cover and wait for the opportune moment to line up a shot. For what it's worth, mooks do throw grenades in an attempt to force you to switch cover, but because explosions are so inefficient, it's better to run a couple meters away and then back to where you were. So every fight is essentially just a shooting gallery, which is not helped by extremely linear arena design. Now, in Chapter 3 it actually makes sense, as it's your first real big combat encounter that also recontextualizes areas that previously were being used for platforming and puzzles. But the corridorish nature is apparent in pretty much every arena out there. Even in larger areas, it's better to just sit behind one piece of cover and treat it like a giant corridor, especially considering that most of the time enemies are going to come out of only a single point on the map until you reach a different trigger point farther down the line, and then they'll keep coming out of only that other single spot. Because of this, it's easy to feel underprepared in the few rooms where that's not exactly the case and bad guys do gather on you from several sides at the same time, but even in those cases it's pretty straightforward to find a single hiding spot from which you can make a bunch of headshots. Maybe this wouldn't have been that bad if not only there weren't as many combat scenarios in the game, but also if there'd been less reinforcements in each. Sometimes the enemies just keep coming and you just have to headshot them. Sooner or later you start dreading any room with waist-high cover, since this means more mooks to boringly dispatch. At least grenade throwing in the PS4 version is more comfortable than the motion-controlled variant on PS3, but they're not that effective of a tool anyway. Still, you're going to shoot just tons of mercs in this game, and Nathan retains his sarcastic and joking personality throughout. Unlike what many people claim, this is not ludonarrative dissonance. Ludonarrative dissonance is a conflict between gameplay and story. However, every story establishes an unspoken narrative contract with us that sets up some boundaries between fiction and reality. One such boundary is that within certain genres or narrative conceits, there's a differentiation between good guys and bad guys, that inside those frameworks it's acceptable for good guys to kill bad guys. We don't complain there's a lack of psychological toll when Luke Skywalker obliterates more than 1 million living beings with a single proton torpedo strike, even though realistically, any sane human would suffer severe consequences regardless of how justified that action might have been. In its narrative contract, Star Wars establishes that it's okay for good guys to kill bad guys, as long as it's done without hate. Uncharted is really no different. Would a story that examines the realistic implications of an adventurer type eliminating so many people be potentially intriguing? Of course, but that's not the kind of story Uncharted tries to tell. And because as part of its narrative contract, the game just ignores the ramifications of killing people who are trying to actively kill you too, there is no dissonance between Drake's personality in the story and how many bad guys we dispatch in gameplay. There is, however, dissonance in said bad guys just swarming in through a single hole over and over again. How did they get there? Why do they keep appearing? And in some cases, how do they even know we have reached a certain spot? In some levels, bad guys fill a river with explosive barrels. They wouldn't necessarily know that we'd travel by water at this particular moment. And the story establishes they actively use their own boats. So there's absolutely no logic in the act of throwing into water an unlimited amount of combustible from a single fired objects, other than this being an obstacle the game wants players to avoid in a particular level. That's ludonarrative dissonance. Us discovering a secret entrance to an underground section that the bad guys know nothing about, and yet still encountering and fighting mercenaries in that location, even though the pathway to the church from which they could potentially enter can be opened only from within the underground chambers, that's ludonarrative dissonance. A conflict between a playable segment and the story with world building the game establishes as part of its narrative contract. So Uncharted Drake's Fortune is definitely not a stranger to ludonarrative dissonance, but the number of bad guys we kill and how that has no impact on Nathan's psyche is not a part of that. Besides, it's not like Nathan is the only one doing the killing. Elena is adept at bad guy elimination as well.
Do you know how to use one of these?
Yeah, it's like a camera. You point and shoot, right?
Good girl.
But once again, that's not a problem. After escaping Gorman's goons, Nate and Elena decide to travel towards the island from the map and find where the Spanish have taken El Dorado.
Well, what are we waiting for? I'll get the story and you get whatever it is you're after.
From here on out, the globetrotting part ends and all action is going to remain focused on that one single island in a connected sequence with no breaks or jump cuts in between, barring one specific exception. We'll start our exploration without Elena again due to being separated after the plane she was on with Nate gets shot at with anti-aircraft fire.
Okay, just jump, count to 5, just pull the cord. How hard could that be? Oh, crap.
One thing that becomes almost immediately apparent after landing on the island is that the pacing gets absolutely borked. Like Uncharted can't live knowing you didn't have a combat encounter for more than a minute. Think about what has happened before. We had a short action tutorial, then a pretty lengthy platforming tutorial with some puzzles, and a chapter that had some jumping around in different contexts followed by a lengthy combat section. Now here's how things are going to look after you land on the main island. You start with a little bit of exploration platforming, then a combat arena, after which you get into a combat arena, followed by a combat arena. Some more platforming leads you into another combat arena, then a more dedicated platforming segment still mixed with combat, which leads you to a combat arena where you're going to fight once before a cutscene and another time after a cutscene. Then you're going to do a little bit of jumping straight into another combat arena. Then you see a fortress with a bunch of climbing handholds. You think that maybe it's finally time to rest from combat. And it is, for 2 platforming sequences. But now you've almost spent 2 minutes without fighting in a combat arena, must fix that. After which you jump into a, you guessed it, combat arena. You climb a tower to get back into the same location to use it as a combat arena again. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through the entire game like that. I just wanted to make it clear that Uncharted goes somewhat overboard with combat arenas. Especially because each fight is not that short and has at least a couple waves of reinforcements. And what we have discussed before still remains true. Whenever you enter an arena, you just have to find the closest hiding spot and take everyone out with headshots. That's the most efficient way to handle it. Now, I do want to mention that it's not all gloom and doom, as Uncharted is not devoid of interesting segments. That platforming one with a little bit of combat mixed in, if you happen to not encounter jumping related bugs, it's pretty enjoyable. One of the combat arenas I've mentioned involves sprinting traps, while another has a stationary machine gun. But all too many of these arenas are just a bunch of covers with waves of enemies dropping in from a single side. Drake's Fortune is not a long game, but this amount of standard arenas makes it feel like it can overstay its welcome. However, I'd be lying if I said it's difficult to enjoy the game, not the least because there is enough of those kinds of actual interesting segments I've mentioned sprinkled in between the boring arenas. And the overall structure of the game's level design does make sense. Uncharted Drake's Fortune is really good at creating a sense of place. You actually get an understanding of the island's geography thanks to the game regularly looping you back into locations you've previously visited. For example, you don't just go through the fortress and that's it. You get to really understand how it was built thanks to you or enemies opening up new paths as you circle back. Close to the end of the game, you're exploring the monastery, and thanks to going through its various parts from different angles, as well as revisiting the courtyard a couple of times, you get to actually understand the layout of the place and how people lived here. Now, if only Uncharted wouldn't ruin that sensation by sending another set of repetitive waves of enemies at you. With this in mind, from the perspective of making you understand how the island is connected, I do get why there are several vehicle set pieces, the point of which is to get you from one location to another while avoiding time skips. However, that still leaves us with the problem of them not being that interesting to play. The Jeep segment could have been a nice change of pace if combat in the game wasn't corridorish already. It's difficult for a shooting gallery to add variety when all the rest of combat is like a shooting gallery anyway. But for what it's worth, that part is infinitely better than the jet ski sections. You have to constantly stop and shoot, try to notice enemies from very far away because they're incredibly accurate and there is no cover to take on a water scooter. More than that, these sections are going to be full of explosive barrels you have to destroy from afar, because touching them just a tiny bit is enough to make you restart checkpoint. Though it's not that bad until you get to the level with upstream waters, where your goal is to go against the flow of the river with an already finicky to control vehicle, while barrels are constantly floating towards you. In comparison to that, some of the other misguided attempts at variety don't look bad at all, like the animation segments where you need to quickly press one button lest you die. They're so short I wouldn't even call them quicktime events. You'll face literally 4 instances of this quote-unquote challenge type in the entire game, and it always feels thrown in out of nowhere. Now, one might ask, well, surely with so many problematic gameplay elements, the nicely designed segments are not enough to motivate you to finish the game. And that would be correct, but Uncharted's writing and characterization really makes you want to see what's going to happen with the core cast.
Let's go.
What if it turns out he's working with them?
We either rescue him or we beat the crap out of him. Hell, I might just beat the crap out of him anyway.
In Drake's Fortune, the actual plotline is very simple and straightforward. To be fair, that's the case with most pulpy adventure stories. It's the characters that make the narrative compelling. And in Uncharted, every member of the core cast goes through a transformation of sorts. We have Sully, who turns out did not die from Baldman's gunshot.
You are not gonna believe this.
No way! Old Francis took a bullet for you.
Yeah.
I thought this kind of thing only happened in the movies.
Yeah, well, it still hurt like a son of a bitch, I'll tell you that.
Doing something cliché while pointing out how cliché it is doesn't make it any less of a cliché. Just saying. The transformation Sully goes through is not as much about him changing as a person as it is about us changing our opinion of him. After his apparent death, Sully was seen working together with Dabri Blue Man, which makes it questionable whether he can be trusted. But not to worry, he's always been loyal to Nate. Sully managed to convince Dude Man thanks to his sweet talking that he can be of help, and send the goons off to random, ultimately fruitless endeavors, stalling for time while waiting for Nathan to arrive. We'll ignore the fact that at one point Sully accidentally sends Doorman precisely to the spot where the team needs to find the next clue. It's the intention that matters. Elena, throughout the adventure, has to learn to let go of her obsessions, manifested in how she never lets go of her camera. She won't rest unless the documentary is finished, to the point that it's Elena who actually pushes Nate to go further inland to keep searching for El Dorado, while Nathan feels his way over his head and wants to escape. But eventually, she does need to let her obsession go. Literally.
Watch where you step. Some of these boards are really falling. I can't hold on! Give me your other hand! You've got to let it go!
Damn it!
Okay.
Oh, shit!
It's okay. Come on. Come on.
And unsurprisingly, there is romance brewing between Elena and Nathan, though I do appreciate how Uncharted tries to have more subtlety. Most other stories would have our main characters tonguing each other inside out by the halfway point already. But here the halfway point is when the romantic interest only starts to appear after Elena notices that underneath Nate's exterior, full of careless, sarcastic demeanor, there's actually someone intelligent, vulnerable, and caring.
Whoa, reading 16th century Spanish? Not just a grave robber after all, huh?
Huh. That's the last entry.
That somebody special?
What? Oh. Yeah. I guess you could say that.
Huh. I had you pegged as more of a woman in every port kind of guy.
Don't I wish? No, this was Francis Drake's ring. I, kind of inherited it.
Sic parvis magna?
Greatness from small beginnings. It was his motto. Check out the date.
29th of January, 1596.
One day after he supposedly died.
Wait, what are these numbers right here?
Coordinates, right off the coast of Panama.
Oh, so that's how you found the coffin.
Yeah, that's right. See, Drake left this as a clue to pinpoint the exact burial site.
For someone clever enough to figure it out.
Yeah, nice try. But we're still going for that boat.
Which leads us to Nate's arc that's about learning to do the right thing. Obviously, he wants fortune and glory, but he's also hesitant to push himself out of his comfort zone. This is manifested not only in the reluctance to keep going after El Dorado, but also practically giving up after finding the body of Sir Francis Drake.
It's Drake. He never found it. He just died here. So much for greatness. Wasted his life. For nothing.
Nate believes that Drake just perished without finishing what he has set out to achieve. He's so disappointed that he even leaves the Ancestor's ring at the body. But things are not as they seem, which becomes apparent when we encounter these little beauties.
Oh, crap.
Drake, if we don't make it out of here, I just want you to know, I hate your guts.
By the way, this is Eddie Raja, and he's definitely the most interesting out of the antagonists, already having some history with Drake before the events of the game. It's a big shame he dies, as he's a much more entertaining foil than any of the other villains. But that's beside the point. It turns out that El Dorado is not just a golden statue. Inside, there is the remains of a body with a curse or a virus that turns everybody afflicted into essentially zombies. And this is the fate that has befallen all the Spaniards who were once inhabiting this colony. Francis Drake didn't just get to the island and fail to find El Dorado. He realized that he could never let this curse leave the place. After all his crew perished, Francis managed to blow up all the ships and raze the entire colony in an attempt to make sure no one lives, and dies after performing this act. And now Nathan needs to do right by his supposed ancestor and honor his legacy by making sure that white men can't live with El Dorado. But before we get to that part, let's talk about the zombies, officially labeled the Descendants. For all the game's faults, the way it handles their appearance is incredibly immersive and memorable. It should be noted that the Descendants don't just appear out of nowhere. Their presence has been hinted at ever since visiting the Nazi U-boat whose captain has been clawed to death. And on the island itself, Uncharted regularly makes sure to note that something is not right.
I'm just saying, something bad happened here. The whole colony doesn't just up and vanish.
Yeah.
Well, how do you explain it?
But this is not what's so great about the handling of the Descendants, no. You see, weapons in Uncharted can be divided into tiers. At first you're going to encounter only tier 1 weapons. Starting with chapter 11, you'll find a couple tier 2 weapons scattered there and there, and in chapter 13 your arsenal fully switches to tier 2. Weapons from this tier can hold more ammo and are more powerful than those from tier 1. However, in chapter 17 you'll see a bunch of tier 1 weapons lying around. This level is all about your first encounter with the Descendants. They're crawling out from every hole, and you're likely to spend all your tier 2 weapon ammo and start replacing it with tier 1. Since the Descendants try to claw you to death, cover is absolutely useless, forcing you to change strategy towards run and gun, creating an entirely different feel of gameplay in comparison to all the previous combat segments. That fight ends with you running through tunnels, shooting at the Descendants following you. The purpose of that segment is to fully deplete even the tier 1 weapon ammo you might have had at that point. After this, in chapter 18 and 19, you will go through an old Nazi bunker. The Germans during World War II actually have managed to find this place and perform experiments with El Dorado. That didn't go well. Now, what you have to do is traverse through a bunch of dark corridors with nothing but an MP40 in your hands, essentially a tier 0 weapon, the weakest of any you have had so far. Even though Uncharted doesn't suddenly become a survival horror, the spike in tension the game manages to achieve not only through the introduction of Descendants, but how smartly it reverts the weapon progression into essentially a negative state relative to the beginning, is immense. Your goal is to turn on the power generator so you could leave the bunker, but after you do that, the Descendants just keep pouring onto your location. It's definitely the most stressful segment in the entirety of Drake's Fortune, but also the most memorable, especially considering that after this you'll have to contend with both Rugam's mercenaries as well as the Descendants crawling all over the place. But sadly, the road to the final showdown is disappointing more so than anything. I mean, first you have to go across a bunch of locations you have already visited before, which is fine in theory. Once again, the concept of looping through places you know is very cool from an atmospheric perspective, if Uncharted wouldn't have decided to shove a bunch of prolonged combat segments up your throat, that this time include tons of sniper enemies. Well, they have laser sights but don't actually use sniper weapons, though that's beside the point. The archetype is still the same. These are probably some of the most boring fights in the entire game up to this point, but Drake's Fortune is not done. After trudging through that, you do get to the final confrontation. I appreciate that Blandale Borman turns out to not be the main antagonist after all. In fact, it's his seemingly useless right-hand man Navarro who has been playing Boredom Man all this time for the purposes of getting El Dorado and making money off its cursed virus thing. But gameplay-wise, it's just all handled in such a rushed manner. First, you have to make your way through a fight between the mercenaries and the Descendants to latch onto El Dorado that's being lifted up in the air. Great concept, but make any extra step to the left or right and you die, so not that fun. You then get onto a ship for a final boss battle with Navarro himself. Well, boss battle is a strong word. What you do is you have to hide behind cover to avoid getting laser tagged by Navarro, which goes against how laser sights worked previously. It was always enough to dodge to avoid getting targeted, but here, unless you're in cover when Navarro pops out, you're dead. Dodge doesn't matter. Then the way to complete the level is actually not to try to shoot at Navarro, but to kill his henchmen. Once they're all dead, he runs away to the next arena where you have to do the same thing, and well, you have to repeat this the third time as well. After this, you get to fight Navarro mano a mano, by first avoiding his shots several times again to then initiate a melee quick time event. Oh, and even though there's enough time to run towards Navarro for a melee attack after his first shot already, the game won't let you do that until you avoid his gunfire precisely 3 times. At the end of it all, Nathan doesn't actually kill Navarro. He gets a karmic death instead, going to the bottom of the ocean alongside El Dorado. Nate learned to do the right thing, Elena gives him back Drake's ring, which she managed to sneakily take when Nate decided to get rid of it, and Sully found a boat with some treasure so the adventure wouldn't end on a total bust.
You two got a funny idea of romantic.
Sully! Wow, you look like hell.
You should see the other guys. Got us a boat.
We already have a boat.
Yeah, big boat.
I like this one better.
Sully, you beautiful son of a bitch!
Borrowed it off a couple of pirates who were too dead to cash.
Everything's great, roll credits. I really wouldn't mind if a bunch of combat scenarios and even the vehicle set pieces were cut if it meant that the game could have invested more resources into the ending, because honestly, well, that's just not it. From a gameplay perspective at least. The writing, acting, and the grandiose music from Nate's theme still leaves you with an overall positive impression that you might not be fully disappointed with these final segments. But all these flaws are definitely going to have an effect on the final Stasocritic score. Stasocritic is a rating system that consists of 5 different categories of various weights. Every category has 11 scores from 0 to 10, and each score has their own criteria. The first category is design, as how a game plays is what defines our experience the most. I will assign a 6. There is not a single gameplay facet that works the way it should. The pacing is incredibly wonky, and a bunch of design decisions meant to introduce variety instead are either frustrating or just out of place. But the game still manages to hold everything well enough together thanks to its overall structure. The handling of the Descendants is accompanied by a very atmospheric weapon progression, and there's a bunch of nice moments in between admittedly boring and frustrating ones. The next category is emotions. It has a weight of 3, as at the end of the day our personal feelings matter a lot. I will assign a 9. I understand that half of the review has been spent criticizing tons of what I feel are valid flaws, but there's still something about the game's writing and structure that makes Uncharted just an enjoyable game to go through. It's weird, on one hand I can't help but complain about the god-awful pacing, and on another, when the credits roll I can't help but think, yeah, overall it was good, wouldn't mind replaying again in a few years. On normal difficulty, to hell with hard or anything higher, I'm not a masochist. Which leads us to cohesion, a category with a weight of 2, that's about how well all the different aspects of the game are connected together into a singular, wholesome experience. I will assign a 5. As we have discussed, there's a bunch of things in Drake's Fortune that go against the narrative contract the game establishes. But also, there are situations like the whole deal with Descendants where Uncharted handles emotions in a way that only video games can, and that's honestly great. So given all that, I think a score that sits strictly in the middle is fitting. Then we have context, a category that's all about story, world building, characters, and their arcs. Basically everything that provides context to the player. I will assign an 8. I'd say the narrative of Uncharted is something one could call standard. A team of adventurers sets out to find a treasure, realizes that it's cursed, and decides to make sure it never gets into the hands of the wrong people. Perhaps there is nothing original to this plot, nor is there anything deep, but it's just really well written. The characters have great personalities, with the exception of Daniel Broman. The arcs are nice, and the ending, story-wise, is ultimately satisfying and priming for future adventures. What more does a game need? Well, a more consistent art style maybe. Since if we go to the aesthetics category, I think I will have to assign an 8. For all of its advances in technology relative to the time of release, Uncharted clearly doesn't know how much stylization it wants to have. It hasn't yet decided on a distinct visual identity, nor did it figure out what it wants to do with music. Outside of a couple particular tunes like Nate's themes and some others, the accompanying soundtrack is, well, not bad or forgettable, but sounding like it's just adventure music, something that doesn't feel like it belongs in Uncharted specifically. The game is definitely still trying to establish its own foothold. And when all the scores and their weights are taken into account, we get a final Stasocritic rating of 70, which in the context of my system means Uncharted Drake's Fortune is a good, solid game that I wouldn't hesitate to recommend to people who enjoy this genre, while everyone else would have to take into account its flaws and decide for themselves if they're ready to endure them or not. At the end of the day, Uncharted Drake's Fortune is like a teenager who hasn't yet figured out what to do with their life. It's still uncomfortable with its body, it hasn't yet found its voice, and it keeps weighing the pros and cons of going to college. Yet for all its flaws, it is endearing and charming. It's probably very fitting that Drake's motto is greatness from small beginnings, since this is exactly what Uncharted 1 is, a small beginning. At this point, we all know how big and popular the franchise has become since 2007, and it all began here. In a game that perhaps did not find its identity yet, a title that can feel like at times it drags on for more than it should, one that doesn't even properly fulfill all of its promises. But that still doesn't make it any less of an engaging experience that I hope you have enjoyed watching me talk about. And if you have, let's have a chat in the comment section regarding your thoughts about Drake's Fortune, and please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you all for watching.